Good morning. Thank you for joining us at the Governor's Committee on People with Disabilities. Today we have a presentation on keeping up with accommodations for the workplace. I'm Matt Dickens, the GCPD Accessibility and Disability Rights Coordinator. Before we begin, I want to share a little bit of information about the GCPD. The GCPD, their mission is to further opportunities for persons with disabilities to enjoy full and equal access to lives of independence, productivity, and self-determination. GCPD recommends changes in disability policies and programs in the areas of accessibility, communication, criminal justice, education, emergency preparedness, employment, health, housing, transportation, and veterans. The committee also supports a network of local committees on people with disabilities, issues awards to promote greater awareness, and promotes compliance with disability-related laws. For this webinar, we do not have chat enabled, so please use the Q&A if you have questions for our presenters. My coworker, Rebecca, will be here with us to help manage the questions. And at the end of the webinar, we will answer your questions. After the webinar, you will get an automated email from Zoom with a link to our GCPD page to access the webinar recording and other materials. The email will also include a survey where you can give feedback. We always appreciate your feedback that you share with us. So July 26th will be the 35th anniversary of the ADA. So state agencies and local organizations are hosting events to recognize people with disability during this special event. So please communicate with us. Let us know what events that you are having throughout the state so we can help advertise for your event. And now let's get started on our presentation. First, we're going to start with the basics of the ADA and how that applies to employment. And then after that part, we're going to discuss what to do when things change. Under the ADA, there are 5 different titles. For employment, it is Title I. Title I applies to employment of people with disabilities. Title I prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities. Employers with 15 or more employees must ensure that people with disabilities have equal opportunities in all aspects of employment, and that includes providing reasonable accommodations. So what are reasonable accommodations? Those are modifications or adjustments to the job or work environment or procedures that enable a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of the job and enjoy equal employment opportunities. So what does that mean? It could include promotion. It could include opportunities to join events. For example, holiday parties that the workplace might host. It also gives opportunities to learn about employment benefits, such as insurance. All of those are included in what needs to be accessible. The boss or the employer is not required to provide durable medical equipment via me, but they need to provide a modification to the policy that allows for an individual to use that DME, such as a hearing aid or a prosthetic. And so how that works could look different. So if you're in a call center and you need to access the telephone system, Some individuals might have a hearing aid that has assistive technology that can connect directly to that system. However, to allow that connection, a change needs to be made to the policy to allow that assistive technology to be used. So job requirements. The ADA describes job requirements in 3 different parts. The first part is essential functions, and that's the requirements that you see in the job posting. And if those are removed, if any of them are removed, it would change the job. And so you have to be able to do all of those functions with or without accommodations. Typically, you will see those in the top portion of the job posting versus some marginal functions might be lower in the job posting. So marginal functions, that's some of the not as essential functions and can be easily removed if a person is unable to do those functions. It can be given to another employee or can be removed entirely. If that is removed, it should not be considered when there are job performance evaluations or promotion considerations. And then required or preferred job requirements like education or experience cannot be accommodated. The interactive process is an incredibly important part of the ADA. So it's described as a collaborative discussion between an employer and the employee or job applicant for the purpose of identifying or implementing reasonable accommodations for a disability that would impact their ability to do their job. So the employer has the burden of proving that they did engage in that interactive process to provide accommodations. So why this is important is that it is a requirement on both sides. Both the employer and the employee must engage and discuss with each other to find a good solution. For example, maybe the first accommodation that was agreed upon to try, the employee says it's not a good accommodation and it's not effective. And so they can approach their employer to see if they can try a different accommodation to address the barrier that's still there. So now we can discuss more deeply about accommodations at work, where to find them and what to do with them. So accommodation requests, that's typically when a person with a disability will ask for an accommodation. Many organizations have a specific procedure for accommodations. It is not a one-size-fits-all process, so it is something that you need to check with each organization to see how they process. You can look in the employee handbook. There's typically a guide or more information about the different policies in that. Or you can contact HR to ask what the accommodation procedure looks like. If you don't have either of these, you can get in touch with who the decision maker is for that business, for example, a boss or a manager. If that is not something that your company has, it is really important that both the employer and the employee are aware of the laws and follow them. Now, some things that the employer might want to consider when they are thinking about, what the employee wants to consider when they're thinking of if an accommodation is right for me. So when they look at the essential functions, is there anything that is a disability related barrier to performing those? Are there disability related barriers to access equal opportunity? For example, there are events happening that you were not informed about or not invited to attend. So that might be a time to think about reasonable accommodations. Another question you might ask yourself is what accommodations would help remove or reduce those barriers. If you can't completely remove the barrier, sometimes it's better to at least reduce them. So there are several options. When you have one option, it can kind of put your employer in a bind because you're making the suggestion that there's only one specific accommodation that can allow you to do your job. And so if that accommodation doesn't work, it can become a complicated situation. So it is a good practice to find several accommodations that are potential fit for your situation and then discuss with your boss what will be the best fit to solve your barriers. So now, from the employer's considerations, what are some things you need to ask yourself as an employer? The ADA does require a minimum standard of 15 employees, and some businesses or companies have less than 15 employees and they don't have to or don't want to provide accommodations, and that's their right. However, many of them do actually want to because it is helpful to their business. Religious organizations with 15 or more employees are not exempt from Title I. State and local governments with less than 15 employees are also not exempt from Title I. Some businesses feel that any exemptions are there any exemptions to the ADA? And yes, there are exemptions based on whether it would be a fundamental alteration to the operations or an undue hardship, which would mean that it would be an incredibly expensive change to make. However, if those exemptions exist, that means that you can't provide that specific accommodation. That does not waive you from your responsibility to provide accommodations in general. You still need to engage in the interactive process and work with the employees to provide an accommodation. So there has been some research recently talking about businesses and their different perspectives on employees, employment, and accommodating people with disabilities. So in North America, we have roughly 18 million private businesses with at least one employee. And there's estimated that about 2 million of those businesses have 15 or more employees. So that's why we want to emphasize that there are many businesses that don't have 15 employees. It's still good for you to think about reasonable accommodations and hiring people with disabilities. Research on employment with people with disabilities found differing perspectives between small businesses and large businesses. And so depending on the size of your company, might change the approach you have to requesting a reasonable accommodation. So we can see the comparison between a small employer and a large employer. So when I say, large or small, it could be a large business, but a small number of employees, or a small business, but a large number of employees. So in this context, we're talking specifically about the number of employees. So a small employer, their organizational structure is typically fewer levels to navigate for approval to reasonable accommodations versus a larger organization that might have an incredibly high vertical structure that takes more time to navigate the approval process. A small employer may also not have an HR or an employee handbook, and they are less likely to have specific policies on accommodations. Most of the time, however, large employers have strict policies on accommodation that must be followed step by step. Smaller employers might view their employee as family, for better or worse. Sometimes, we treat our families well and sometimes we do not. So a large employer typically looks at employees as an asset for their production purposes. And they focus on output. Finally, smaller employers, the research shows that they have more of a fear of the ADA because they do not have as much knowledge or resources on the ADA. Versus large employers view the ADA as as a risk that is part of the business that must be managed. So whether it's a small or a large employer, it could be a range. It could be 2 or 3 employees, all the way up to 20 to 30,000 employees. So I'll give some examples of some of my interactions with people in the past who have requested accommodations. In a small employer situation, I had one person contact me because they had worked for a small business. It was $1 million business, and they provided services throughout the country for medical equipment. But she herself was a secretary responsible for answering the phone. She was starting to lose her hearing, and she was starting to notice that she was making more mistakes that was impacting the business and their bottom line. So she felt she was afraid to let them know about her hearing loss, because if she let them know, they might fire her. And she, was afraid because technically the ADA didn't protect her. And so I encouraged through her to approach her employer with a slightly different approach. Instead of saying, hey, the ADA, instead talk about how she wants to support the success of the business and how this accommodation could help her continue to work and continue to accept the business. And so she went and asked for a temporary accommodation so that she could get her hearing aids. And after she was done, after our discussion, she left and I didn't hear from her. And later she called me back and she was crying. And I was like, oh no, something went wrong. But no, she was so happy because her employer was like, we value you so much and we understand what you need, and we would love to work as much as we can to support you. And she felt really touched and she really felt valued by her company. And so that's just an example of what we would hope that would happen in most situations with small employers. Versus a large employer, I've had some examples that related to my personal experience. When I was working for a large company, it was my first job. I was 18 years old. And I went to work for a company that didn't really explain much about how you could move up within their business, their promotion schedule. And I kept also getting in trouble. And the reason for that was because I was doing a data entry job. It's just keyboarding, putting numbers in, and I would finish very, very early for the day. Like basically by lunchtime, I would be done with my whole assignment for the whole day. So I would start bothering other people or read. And so my employer kept scolding me and I kept getting written up. And I was like, I'm doing my job well, but how is this, why does this keep happening? So my employer wound up hiring a new manager. And that manager, kind of observed the situation and sat me down and said, that you can, if you do more and finish more, you can earn more money and you can get promoted. And I had no idea about that. I did not know that there was like a ladder or that I could do those things. Like my eyes basically came out of my head. And so I was so thankful to my manager for recognizing that and realizing that and sitting down and explaining it to me, because after that I became one of the top earners. But that's why it's so important to make sure that managers and employers really sit down and discuss with their employees. And so think about, how can the business best maximize their output or production by providing that reasonable accommodation. It's not about my disability. It's about, how can I do this job the best? And so that benefits both the employer and the employee, because the employer will, continue to exceed their production, and the employee can continue doing great work. Documentation. So this is talking about medical documentation. We have lots of questions to our office related to this. So we wanted to clarify here. So the ADA says that if it's obvious or apparent, such as, having a white cane or a person using a wheelchair, it is immediately covered by law. Doesn't matter whether medical records have been provided or not. However, employer can still say, we want to, require this for all employees. And so you can ask for that documentation. However, if the employee hasn't yet provided that, you cannot use that as an excuse to not provide the accommodation in the meanwhile. For not apparent disabilities, the employee has the burden of informing the employer. If the employer doesn't know, that is not their responsibility. The employee needs to let the employer know that they have a barrier that needs to be addressed. At that point, the employer might ask for medical documentation to verify the disability, and that can include getting a reasonable accommodation request from the doctor. This is because a lot of employers sometimes think that doctors know how to solve these barriers, but I do want to give a little bit of a warning for employers who rely specifically and solely on the doctor accommodation suggestion. They're not always the best source, because they do not know your business. They do not know how your business might best benefit from the accommodations or best suit the accommodation. So it's really important to also use other resources that are skilled in considering business operations while providing accommodation examples. Sometimes getting accommodations is a really long process, or getting the medical records. And so it's really a best practice for employers to provide a temporary accommodation while your employee waits to receive the formal and official accommodations. So choosing an accommodation. So remember what I said about the doctor. So we have some other resources that you can use to choose an accommodation. The best approach is to focus on the barrier itself to the workplace rather than the disability. That's because sometimes the disability, what would help solve the disability, would not help accommodate in the business specific environment. So the interactive process also works like a negotiation. Sometimes the employee feels that the employer must follow what the employee wants. And that is not the case. It's also not the case that an employer is forced to provide an employee with an accommodation that they do not feel is appropriate. The employer is also not required to give the specific equipment, such as a hearing aid. And if the requested accommodation is not appropriate for the business and they decide that that's not a reasonable accommodation, they must work with the employee to identify an alternative solution that can effectively address the barrier. So I mentioned some resources, and here is our list. There's the Job Accommodation Network, and this is one of the best possible resources because you can search by the disability, because if you're not sure about what potential barriers it might be. You can also look through the tasks. You can look through the barriers itself, and you could search by the task. For example, say typing. You can pull out all of the different possible accommodations for typing. So it's a really great resource. Another thing I like about that resource is that they list the different accommodations and where you can get them, the price of them. So it's super helpful in making that decision and determination on what is the best and most appropriate accommodation for the business. Another one I really like to suggest is TWC Vocational Rehabilitation Services. They are able to provide rehabilitation services, durable medical equipment, and other supports for employment. So they are focused on helping with people with disabilities both find a job and maintain their job. And then also, if somebody, lost their hearing or became disabled in some other way, they can also go to VR to help to maintain and keep that job. The Texas Workforce Commission Civil Rights Division is also a good resource. That's a program that's run by Texas Workforce Commission that assists with the EOC in resolving ADA Title I complaints. So now we've talked about the basics of the ADA. Let's look about changing workplace dynamics. When things change, what can we expect? You can expect the interactive process to be continuous over time. When there are technological updates, changes in procedures, staff turnover, facility relocations, workplace dynamic changes happen all the time. If you're not considering people with disabilities, when those changes happen, there's much more of a risk of them being left behind. For example, one common thing we've seen is when the boss or the manager is replaced or changes, the person who hired the person with a disability was already bought into that idea of having accommodation. They made the reasonable accommodation request. They went through the interactive process. And so when that boss is now promotes or leaves the organization and a new manager comes in, they might not have any information about the reasonable accommodations or how to accommodate people with disabilities or their current employees who have disabilities. And so that can cause dysfunction and some dilemmas in the workplace. And so it's really important that managers remember that they might have employees in the workplace who already have disabilities or reasonable accommodations, and it's important they maintain their training on that. It can cost 10 times as much to include accessibility after the fact. Many accommodations also benefit employees without disabilities, and that creates a strong case for accessibility. So for example, like maybe you have a new building and you don't put an elevator in, and then later you realize, oh, that person, would need elevator access because they use a wheelchair. Now trying to install an elevator into that already built building is incredibly expensive. And that person with who uses a wheelchair will use the elevator, but many other people would also benefit from having an elevator in general as well. So it's very important for employers to factor them in the planning. We understand it's not possible to plan for every situation, but consider the common disabilities when we are in our planning stages. Some examples. So if you change your location, you relocate to a new building or a new area, there can be accessibility concerns. And so to help them prepare and to ease their mind, notify employees as far in advance as possible. Because, sometimes maybe they rely on a specific type of public transportation to get to work. And so if they are told last minute, they might not be able to change their transportation situation as quick enough to make that change. Maybe the workplace, they can go to the new location ahead of time in order to evaluate whether there are potential accessibility needs, such as like the elevator. And so that would make the transition as smooth as possible. And so if there are any self-identified policy or accommodation issues, make sure you alert your employer as soon as possible. So another one is telework, whether it's you're in person and now you're switching to telework or vice versa. The employer can make an exemption to the telework policy. However, as long as that doesn't make a fundamental alteration to business operations. Prior to COVID, telework was considered one of the absolute last possible accommodations. A lot of people thought it was too complicated or maybe expensive. However, post-COVID, we've seen that this has been a much easier transition to make. However, it really depends on the employer model and business model. So talk with your manager or your employer about those options. So changing software programs, we know that can happen a lot. We know technology changes and businesses want to keep up with those technological advances. So employers should check with the vendor about accessibility prior to purchasing. Many companies have what's called a VPAT or a voluntary product accessibility template. And that details how a product or service conforms to accessibility standards. And you also want to make sure that the program is able to be connected to via personal aids or devices. So an employee who uses an electronic device like a hearing aid or another type of technology might realize that they're stuck because the technology itself needs to be updated in order to integrate with their personal technology. And so to make sure that your program or new software that you purchase works with your employees' personal assistive devices. And so that's also what they use as their accommodation might also need to be updated, such as like a TTY. Many deaf people do not use TTYs anymore. And we don't use that as an accommodation because we have video phones now, and that's where a deaf person can sign directly to the person or interpreter on the phone. So me as an employee, I would be responsible for letting my employer know to say this is outdated and there's new equipment that we need to use for me instead. The employee should always communicate with their employer when those updates are needed. So we're going to look at some different workplace formats that we've seen, especially where we've seen lots of changes. So there's staffing agencies, there's 1099 contracts, and then there's gig work. Those are kind of new forms of employment methods, and there's not a lot of guidance currently from the ADA on what authority the ADA has on this. So courts are still in the process of deciding where the ADA and how the ADA applies. It's really important for you guys to include in the work contract how you will accommodate employers. If it's not in the contract, it might be something that you need to negotiate with the business itself. Another thing is that even if whether accessibility is not determined or settled by the courts, it is required that any website, apps, software, activities reported through the organization is accessible. So for example, the state has a contract bidding system, and if it's not accessible, then a person with a disability who's interested in that contract needs to contact them and let them know we need to have an accessible way to bid for this contract. Potential future changes. We are unable to predict all of the potential changes, but there are still some things that we can do to get prepared. So we might see some changes in workplace innovation, changes in professional attire. For example, one person contacted us about a new uniform that was being required by their company. They had just set up a new policy to require uniforms, and that employee used a wheelchair and was very concerned because the uniform was not able to be worn effectively with the wheelchair. And so that was a place where we needed to interact more with the employer. We also know AI has been a big impact recently and will be growing in the future. And so it's important to continue to consider those technological trends. And so for the employee, it's important to build a strong network. That means build a strong relationship with your boss, with your HR department, with the accommodations team or system. And that way things will run more smoothly when things do change. It's also a good practice to keep up about current trends. So we know like whether companies are changing their clothes. We've seen a huge trend for attire or other aspects like AI being more used or disallowed. Another thing is that continue to keep up your training because you're only covered by the ADA if you remain qualified. And so they can't waive requirements that they are looking to implement in their job. And so that's why it's really important for you to continue to stay up to date with all of your training. For employers, it's really important to think about accessibility during planning as well, allowing flexibility with those new policies that are implemented and communicating changes in advance as early as possible. So some resources for accessibility. Other than the ones that I've mentioned before, here are some other great resources. The Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, they have a focus on architectural barriers and the elimination of those architectural barriers. So if you're not sure if your business complies with Texas accessibility standards, you can check their website to see. If you're doing any kind of renovation or modification that is $50,000 or more, you will need to also make sure that you are in compliance with accessibility. I know that I mentioned the Job Accommodation Network before, but it is such a great resource that it bears mentioning again. And then finally, the Southwest ADA Center. There are ADA centers throughout the nation. The Southwest ADA Center is the one that covers Texas. And they are federally funded and they answer questions about the ADA and they provide trainings. However, they are not lawyers and they cannot answer legal questions, but specific questions to the ADA, they are able to answer. So some more resources for accessibility. The Texas HHSC Deaf and Hard of Hearing Resource Specialist. It's offered through HHSC, and there are both access and technology specialists, and they help throughout the state. They can help with adjustment to hearing loss. They can help with understanding what requirements for accessibility there might be as well. Then there's also the Centers for Independent Living. These are support services for independent living of people with disabilities, meaning empowering them to live at home and in their communities. And then finally, there's the area agencies on aging. They provide support services for aging Texans, and as well as support modifications and adjustments to disability. So we are now wrapping up our presentation. Before we close, we'd like to check with my coworker about some of the questions that have come through from the audience. As well, we have a list of different information that we have from GCPD and some of our activities if you're interested to check out on your own time. Yes, we have a question on if somebody works in the medical field, how does the ADA apply? Does it still apply for somebody who works in a medical setting? Okay, so that person asked, if the person is in the medical field, how does the ADA apply to that person? Okay, so the medical field is an interesting area because that field often involves risk and safety of patients. So sometimes you need to look at whether that accommodation causes a threat or risk to the patient, because that patient, their safety is always going to be the priority and the safety of all the employees. But so I've seen where medical professionals try to find accommodations that couldn't meet that standard, which meant that unfortunately they had to talk with their HR and be reassigned to a different department that maybe had less risk for the patient, or transfer to a non-medical profession that is equivalent in position and rank. Because you cannot demote that person, you have to find an equivalent job. So the other question, okay, so we have another question about if you are an employer and you provide telework as an accommodation to one of your employees, how do you deal with making sure that other employees who are not getting that accommodation, it doesn't kind of ruin their morale, or how do you make sure that your workplace culture stays positive? So the question about telework, that's an interesting one because there's a lot of modification to those telework policies right now. But it's really important, obviously, to keep confidentiality. We're not allowed to share information about that person with a disability. So what you can do is say that the telework policy and how to discuss with HR about telework and asking for an exception to those rules. So that's where you would emphasize it is a case by case basis. And most of the time employees understand that some employees have different rules or different situations. But again, it's really important that that HR gives that appearance of fairness. And so including that clearly in the policy that the HR, that telework is on a case by case basis is very important. But okay, I think that is all of the questions. Thank you for watching and attending our presentation. We look forward to all of your feedback. See you next time.